So I will start the dialogue today. Thank you, Anne, and hi, good morning and good evening. Depends where you are, and hello everyone. My name is Henry Huiyao Wang. I'm the founder and president of Center for China and Globalization. Welcome to this special dialogue of the 6th China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum, live from CCG head office in Beijing. So thank you for joining us today. We are honored and very pleased to have Professor Steve Roach with us today. We've been knowing Professor Steve Roach for many years. He's really a very renowned international expert and also economist on China-US relations and economics. And this is actually the 20th episode of CCG Global Dialogue. So for this year, we've been in dialogue with a number of world opinion leaders. So as we're approaching to the year end of 2021, it is time for us to reflect and also to conclude of this year's major development, achievement, and major events, and trend and future development for the US-China relation and globalization, of course, for that matter as well. So before we get into that, allow me to quickly introduce our guest today. Professor Stephen Roach is a renowned economist with a distinguished career spanning nearly 5 decades in economic research, finance, and academia. He is currently a senior fellow at the Yale University Jackson Institute of Global Affairs and a senior lecturer at the Yale School of Management. He was formerly chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia in Hong Kong, and also the Morgan Stanley's chief economist in New York. Before that, he worked also in Federal Reserve and started his career at the Brookings Institution. I was visiting fellow Brookings one time, we heard your name. His latest book, which actually probably not latest, but his recent book was Unbalanced, the Codependency of America and China. Examines the risks and opportunities of what is likely to be the world's most important economic relations of the 21st century. I know you, in the last 6 months, you've been working on another book, Accidental Conflict, also describing, analyzing the potential pros and cons and the potential conflict of China-US relations. So we'd love to hear all of that. So welcome, Professor Roach. Maybe you can give a bit of opening remarks for having you on this dialogue.
Well, thank you very much, Henry, and it's a pleasure to see you again and to participate in a CCG Global Dialogue program. I've had great admiration for your organization since its inception, and it's a pleasure to join those who have commented. As we near the end of 2021, I can't help but think back a year ago at the end of 2020 and how different the world looked today than it did back then. Back in the end of 2020, we were still in shock over the outbreak of the COVID-19 global pandemic. The world had come back, at least started to come back, but many, myself included, were skeptical of the staying power of the economic rebound. We were continued to express some concern about the aftershocks of the pandemic. As the year came to an end in the United States, where I continue to be right now, we were in a very difficult period between the Trump administration and the then incoming administration of Joe Biden. There was a lot of controversy after our presidential election, and some of that controversy, unfortunately, remains a factor today. But there was a lot of hope that as we transitioned from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, that there would be a dramatic change and improvement in the U.S.-China relationship. That has not happened, and that's been a surprise to many people. And so, as we sit here at the end of 2021, and we continue to see significant conflict on many fronts with respect to the United States and China, whether it's trade, technology, or even escalating rhetoric that many believe is reminiscent of a Cold War type of conflict. There's good reason to worry about the future of the U.S.-China conflict. The U.S. economy has performed very well over the past year. Our unemployment rate has fallen more sharply in the last 12 months than in any 12-month period in modern history. But we always have things to worry about. That's why we're called economists. We practice the dismal science, and so we are programmed to worry. And in the U.S., we're worried because we've had an outbreak of fairly significant inflationary pressures that has taken a lot of people by surprise, especially the Federal Reserve. And it looks to us like they're going to have to tighten monetary policy to limit the acceleration of inflation and do that a good deal sooner than they had anticipated. And so that raises questions about 2022, especially with respect to the financial markets, where the stock market and the bond market have enjoyed extraordinary support from easy money for a long, long time. And if the Federal Reserve begins a sooner than expected monetary tightening, then that support will be drawn into question. Meanwhile, in your country, the Chinese economy has slowed after an extraordinary recovery from COVID-19 in the final 3 quarters of 2020. But you have a new problem that is personified by the significant pressures that have been brought to bear on Evergrande, your second largest property developer company, with a company that has a huge overhang of some $300 billion of debt. The Chinese government has moved aggressively and understandably in recent years to reduce the debt intensity of your economy. This so-called deleveraging campaign is important, it's been underway now in one form or another for the past 5 years to make certain that China does not go down the road that Japan did in the 1990s when it was brought to a state of virtual stagnation after its own serious debt-intensive burst of economic growth that led to asset bubbles, which then burst and brought the Japanese economy into a 3-decade-plus period of stagnation, where it still is mired today. So in an effort to avoid a Japanese-like outcome, deleveraging has become a high priority of the Chinese government, and I'm hopeful that the government, as it's doing with Evergrande, stays with its focus on deleveraging to prevent a Japanese-like outcome. So, the Chinese economy, I think, is still in relatively good shape. It will withstand the Evergrande problems much better than many observers in the West believe. The U.S. economy is also in pretty good shape, but it will need to address its inflation problem. The biggest risk in the two economies is not their own economies, but the conflict that has arisen between them. And so I'm hopeful as I look to 2022 that both nations can come together in a spirit of conflict resolution rather than in a spirit of conflict escalation. And that will require major steps on the part of leaders in both nations. And we can only hope that they have the wisdom to do that. So why don't I stop at that point and turn it back to you, Henry.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thank you for these excellent opening remarks. I think you outlined what's going on in the U.S. economy is also getting better. Of course, China has achieved quite substantial growth of its GDP in for the 3 quarters. But also, on potential risk of Evergrande is kind of that issue. But also, I agree with you. The most probably the danger and risk is this potential conflict that you mentioned. So what do you think about this? We have a Biden now in office for almost exactly, since he won the election, almost exactly 1 year now, and we had. How much that is different from President Trump, how much he was, the business community's expectation, and also, of course, the general society of China-U.S. relations expectation that he has delivered or not. And we see him suffer a bit on the appealing polls. And also, of course, now we have this. He's having the democracy summit. Tomorrow, and today he met President Putin virtually. But last month he met President Xi virtually as well. So we see a host of issues going on. Since the March meeting of Alaska between top diplomats between China and the U.S. So where do you see this U.S.-China relationship go, and what do you think about the business impact? And also that also goes to the pandemic fighting, climate change cooperation. But also, after all, I think the business is the back door, back pillar of our bilateral relations. So that is also affected by this tense relations. So what's your analysis of the Trump administration, past, now, and future? And also, he could, we're having a midterm election next year. He's facing all kind of challenge, but also he has managed to pass the infrastructure bill, and so at least to have something going on. So how do you assess that?
Well, it's sort of interesting, Henry, to think about what President Biden has done. You're right, the election was a year ago, but he's only been in office now for about 9.5 months. It seems like a much longer period of time, but he's still a very new president. But what was particularly interesting is on the first day he took office, January 20th, 2021, he signed, I think, 14 executive orders that reversed many of the most unpopular policies that President Trump had put into place. The border wall with Mexico, the immigration issue, the ban on Muslim travel. He rejoined the Paris Agreement on climate change. He rejoined the World Health Organization. Virtually almost any of Trump's most unpopular positions were reversed in the very first day of the Biden administration, except for one thing: his view on China. He has not changed the Trump administration policy with respect to China. The tariffs are still in place. The sanctions on a large number of Chinese technology companies are still in place. And there continues to be very difficult and tough rhetoric. If anything, it's escalated over human rights and territorial issues from Taiwan to the South China Sea. You mentioned the meeting in Anchorage at the end of March. That meeting was a disaster. You had senior foreign officials in both countries talking as if we truly were in a Cold War. And you have to ask yourself, why did President Biden change so many policies but leave the Trump administration policy in place with respect to China? And I think it boils down to another point that you mentioned, Henry, and that is that President Biden is certainly, has a major problem in the public opinion polls in the United States right now. His approval rating is exceptionally low for a newly inaugurated president. Usually, we give our new presidents what they call a honeymoon period, where their popularity goes way up and they enjoy broad bipartisan support. For President Biden, the honeymoon was the shortest on record. And, whether it's the ongoing problems with COVID, the very contentious debate over vaccine and mask mandates, the inflation problem that I mentioned earlier, some of the racial issues in the United States, whatever it is, his approval rating is, at an extremely low level. I think only about 40% of Americans approve of the job that he's doing, which is too bad because he's got a very thin majority in the U.S. Congress, and there's very little, given the thin majority he has, that he can actually do. And the fact that he has enacted this large infrastructure plan earlier on a bipartisan basis is a fairly significant accomplishment. But, the final point I'd make in response to your question is that, we have a lot of polarization in the United States right now. The Republicans do not agree with anything the Democrats stand for, and the Democrats don't agree with anything that the Republicans stand for. But the two parties are united on one issue, and that is their concern and their negative view on China. The Pew Research Organization in Washington conducts a poll twice a year on American sentiment toward China. and it's now at a record low, almost matching the level of negative sentiment that the American public has toward Joe Biden. And if you look at the detail in the poll, it's Republicans and Democrats. It's old people, it's young people, it's college educated, it's those who did not go to college. It's widespread, and that's too bad. I think it's based on a number of incorrect impressions that Americans have formed with respect to China, which motivated me to write the book that I have been working on for the past 6 months, because I think there are a number of false impressions that Americans have with respect to China. And I think there are a number of false impressions that the Chinese leaders and the Chinese public may have with respect to the United States as well. And these false impressions can lead to what my working title of the book concludes is a state of accidental conflict, the conflict that didn't have to happen, but it has happened. I think the negative sentiment in America toward China, again, bipartisan in support, together with President Biden's own very low approval ranking, is what keeps him and prevents him from really changing the Trump administration's policy with respect to China. He's at a pretty low point in the public opinion polling cycle. And, I think his political advisors say, why take on an issue where there is such widespread support for staying tough on China? And so I think President Biden is, reluctant to risk political capital by changing policies that I think were wrong as established by the Trump administration. And so the challenge is to figure out what it will take to bring this conflict to an end in this context.
Yeah, thank you, thank you, Steve, for your assessment there. Yeah, you're right. I think that what I can see is that from 4 years Trump in the office, he has really brought down these 4 decades of relatively stable Sino-US relations. I mean, he actually made these. He has actually projected China as take advantage of U.S. and the here and there, all those accusations, and so even though Trump is has left office, but Trumpism is still very strong. One of the things I'm thinking is, of course, the U.S. and China on the business side, there's enormous business for the U.S. China in the last 4 decades. For example, you're the expert on that. For the last 4 decades, there's about 70,000 U.S. company has set up in China, making 700 billion revenue a year in China. I mean, just Apple alone make 50 billion a year in China. And the Qualcomm makes 60% of its business in China. So, I mean, I just been to the Universal Studio here in Beijing. It's been packed with, flooded with tourists during the national holidays, and it's just they opened the largest Universal Studio in the world in Beijing, and then has just opened 1/3 of it in Beijing. So they're going to continue to expand here. Of course, Tesla is doing marvelous well, and Tesla, almost become the largest company because they have this new technology, a new clean vehicle, big manufacturer based in China. So I see all the good sense of relationship. For example, in the last 4 decades, 4 million Chinese students went to the United States. and 3 million tourists went to the United States every year before pandemic. So that kind of narrative is not there, but the U.S. economy is suffering, and then China often take all the blame. One of the issues I'm thinking is that, for example, we see this this top elite at the 1% is really getting very even though during the pandemic their wealth is still increasing. We're middle class, for the last 30 years is stagnated and zero increase. So do you think that with all those dissatisfied middle class, dissatisfied blue collars, and they continuously voting anti-globalization, anti-China politicians to the Congress, and then they actually form the bipartisan, and China will be the easiest scapegoat for the domestic policy of U.S. For example, how does it handle the widening gap between rich and poor? So what do you think about that? Because it's not right. All the domestic issues, China become the scapegoat on that. But of course, China has its problem too, but not really affecting U.S. that much. And so it seems very ironically to see, they all form these negative opinions on China. But after all, China is doing, very well. KPI-wise, is probably one of the best in the world, and contributed over 1/3 of global GDP, and lifted 800 million people out of poverty. 10 years ahead of time, realized UN Sustainable SDG #1 objective. So what do you think? I mean, now they are also comparing the democracy now. So USA is having democracy summit. China just had the democracy forum itself. So it's interesting to see on this democracy forum, all compare the bottom line and how effective the implementation and the KPI. Let's compare KPI. So what do you think about all those arguments that we see in the societies?
Yeah, well, you touch on a lot of difficult yet very important issues, Henry. But I just want to pick up on a couple of strands and tie them together. You're right that we have a serious problem in the United States with income and wealth inequality, and it's gotten worse in recent years. We're not alone in that. There's been problems of rising wealth and income inequality around the world, and in fact, President Xi Jinping has made this a centerpiece of his own campaign starting this summer for restoring a common prosperity, which is all about dealing with inequality that has been a growing and worrisome problem in China as well. But the point you made when you started this line of question is a very important one, and that is that in the United States, the politicians have turned this problem into blaming it on China. And the logic goes something like this. The American middle class has been damaged because of a large and growing trade deficit. And the biggest piece of that deficit is with China. I think the numbers were as recently as 2016, China accounted for about 48% of the total merchandise trade deficit. And the final piece of the argument that was made by earlier administrations, but especially by the Trump administration, was that the Chinese trade deficit is an outgrowth of unfair trading practices that go back to allegations that are made with respect to technology transfer, industrial policy, innovation policy. And so the narrative that's come out of this is that the American middle class has been squeezed because China cheats, and therefore the U.S. administration is justified in imposing steep tariffs on China. And I've analyzed this story for a number of years, and most of it is false. There are some elements of truth to some of the allegations, but let's just look at the trade piece, for example. The U.S. does have a large trade deficit with China, although it has gotten a good deal smaller since the tariffs were imposed in 2018. But the plain fact of the matter is that the data from our own U.S. Department of Commerce indicates that we have trade deficits in any given year with roughly 100 different countries. We have a multilateral problem, not a bilateral problem with China. And the multilateral problem reflects the fact that as a nation, we do not save. And the economics are very clear. When you don't save and you want to grow, you import surplus saving from abroad, and you run a big deficit on your balance of payments or your current account to attract the foreign capital. And that's what gives rise to a multilateral trade deficit. You can't address the multilateral trade deficit by making, or starting a trade war on a bilateral basis. If you do that, but you don't raise your level of national savings, then the deficit that you attack through tariffs just gets diverted somewhere else. And that's exactly what's happened. We've lowered our trade deficit with China because of Trump's tariffs, but the overall trade deficit has gotten considerably bigger because it's been offset by increased deficits with a large number of countries, such as Mexico, Vietnam, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore. And so we're shifting the Chinese portion of our trade deficit to higher cost trading partners, which tragically are putting a pressure on American businesses and consumers. You're entirely right, Henry. Over the last 35 years, trade and growing business ties between our two nations has been the anchor of the U.S.-China relationship. But the Trump administration pulled up the anchor, and that has backfired. It's based on bad economics and destructive politics. And what worries me is that the Biden administration, by staying with the same policy of the Trump administration, this so-called phase one trade deal that was agreed upon by the two countries in January of 2020, Biden doesn't want to change it. My advice is to tear it up. That deal is a destructive deal. There's a better way to address our differences than that. And it's an outgrowth of bad economics trying to fix a multilateral problem through a bilateral trade deficit. It won't work. It won't work in theory, and it hasn't worked in practice.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think that actually you outlined very clearly. I think all those misconception and actually the narrative in the U.S. actually has been shifted on China negatively because of this probably an incorrect and accurate assessment of this deficit. China
Henry, can I just say?
Sure.
Add one more thing?
Yeah.
We did the same thing 30 years ago with Japan. In the 1980s, when we first had a trade problem, we discovered that the biggest piece of the trade deficit then was Japan. So we blamed Japan. And Japan made a number of mistakes in responding to US pressure that have led to serious problems in the Japanese economy. Chinese leaders have studied the Japanese precedent, and they know full well that what we're doing by blaming China right now is almost identical to what we did in blaming Japan in the 1980s. And America has a hard time facing up to its own responsibilities. It's much easier to blame others. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, thank you, Steve. Absolutely, I can't agree more with your assessment that multilateral deficit, using a bilateral deficit approach to tackle it is not really the right approach. I mean, you're right. I mean, since the trade war, we see the neighboring countries like Vietnam become the large, hugely increased. ASEAN become a largest trading partner with China because a lot of things China used to go out from China now go from ASEAN. So ASEAN certainly become the largest trading partner with China as well. And also, this kind of deficit concept is not really analyzed scientifically because a lot of, product made in China, but the price was calculated on China, but China didn't, only made the labor cost on that. So and not counting those services that U.S. has a huge plus. So I mean, probably China, but also U.S. We haven't really got these numbers correct. Whereas Trump was simply 300 billion deficit on China, whatever. That got very, very widely spread. So that, as you're right, that built up the concept of China is taking advantage. But I think it's time now. We need a realistic assessment. We need to change that concept and really coming to solving this key problem. I noticed that President Biden, proposed this global flat corporate income tax, corporate tax, G20, and then 130 countries adopt that. So probably those are the way, instead of a lot of companies make money overseas, maybe they could repatriate back to live to the Midwest or Rust Belt. And rather than, money are stayed overseas, then the U.S. government hasn't got a really effective policy to handle those domestic issues. And then China really become a scapegoat. So I think there's a lot of way to go ahead on those problems. But you're absolutely right. Abandon this tariff tactic is really important because after all, I think this competitive advantage is still, David Ricardo's this theory is still valid. Like now, during this pandemic time, we see the U.S. port paralyzed almost, and then huge containers from China, can be loaded and supply the market. So China is really, hasn't really probably make that clear. But what do you see the future path out of this crisis or whatever trade tariff war we have? How we can get out of that gradually?
Well, I expressed the view that from the U.S. side, there are enormous political pressures on President Biden to stay tough on China. But leadership is tricky. The U.S. we have all these public opinion polls that seem to guide every step that politicians take. And yet, at the end of the day, leaders succeed when they have the courage to take tough steps that don't necessarily agree with the short-term polling results. So, if you ask me what President Biden should do, which is not something that he has asked me, by the way, so I'll, in the interest of full disclosure, tell you that I'm not in communication with his China team, at least directly. I certainly am through what I write and how I speak. I think the biggest issues that need to be addressed are many of the tough structural issues that, in fact, were raised by the Trump administration, not necessarily raised on the best of evidence, but issues that ultimately are important to the long-term competitiveness and prosperity of both countries. Things like innovation policy, technology transfer, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, cybersecurity, the monopolies of the issues that are addressed through outbound and incoming merger and acquisition activity. These are all really important issues where there is a good deal of disagreement between the two countries. And I would prefer to see us really focus on developing a framework to address the structural issues rather than the bilateral trade issues, which are an outgrowth of our macroeconomic savings imbalances. And what I write about in my book that will be coming out shortly, I hope, is a framework to address the structural issues by going back to the bargaining table and negotiating a bilateral investment treaty. We were negotiating a bilateral investment treaty between the US and China for about 10 years until Trump came into office in 2017, and he stopped it. And we were probably 90 to 95% of the way complete. A bilateral investment treaty is important because it focuses on economic growth of two partners who can increase their access into each other's markets, provided that access is negotiated and underwritten by strong, legally binding agreements. And we were, again, 90 to 95% of the way there. And I think if we go back to that framework, we will be much more effective in resolving the major structural differences between our two economies and do so in a pro-growth, win-win framework. The trade war is lose-lose. The tech war is lose-lose. A new Cold War is lose-lose. So we need a new framework, Henry. And by staying with the framework that we've been engaged in for the last 4 years of the Trump administration and the first 9 to 10 months of the Biden administration, we're going to stay in this condition of lose-lose. And we've got to come up with a new framework. And I write about this in this new book.
Yeah, excellent. I think, Steve, you have proposed excellent ideas. I think this, as you said, this this bilateral investment treaty in 2016 when they had the G20 is almost signed then. You know, our senior advisor, former Vice Minister Zhu Guangyao, Minister of Finance, actually was calling the G20 meetings at the financial ministry. And then he was telling me, you know, it was almost done. He almost said at the television, we're going to sign this before the G20 in Hangzhou that year. So absolutely, we need a framework to really engage the dialogues. Rather than now, we're seeing the U.S. keep adding the entity list. Even President Biden comes out, we see a number of more entity lists added to the sanction list, and that actually jeopardized the not only hurting Chinese business but also hurting U.S. business. For example, those semiconductor and all those chips now you cannot buy from U.S. It's a huge loss to U.S. That's created this shortage of chips. Many computers are not able to be manufactured at old style pace. It's actually a lot of shortage and things like that. And also further, it will really cripple probably the international semiconductor industry, and then you have that, hurting the both world economy and U.S. China as well. So what do you think? The way that we can really work together. I mean, of course, this investment treaty is an excellent idea. I think we should really come back to that, and we should really do more on those issues. The other thing I was thinking was now, what are the next biggest draw? What are the next biggest pie that all the countries can have a share of that? Last week, the EU announced Eurogate, 300 billion euro going to be spent on the infrastructure. President Trump passed 1.2 trillion on the infrastructure. China has done its BRI for infrastructure for the last 8 years. So this is the biggest, probably next 50 years of big incentive for the world to come together to upgrade our infrastructure. And China, US have this B3W, Build Back Better World, and EU, this Gateway EU. So what do you think? Climate change, of course, is one area. Pandemic fighting is another area. China has pledged billions of dollars. US has pledged billions, and vaccines and donations. So, but we should probably have coordinated efforts, find something, with common interest of the world, and the two largest economies should really work together. So, what do you think about new initiative that can bring us together? Of course, CPTPP is another angle designed by the U.S. Now, China is willing to join that. Minister of Commerce has put CPP agreement on the Ministry MOVCOM website to show to the Chinese company, here is the standards, here is the target you should shoot for. So U.S. was helping design that. Let's talk on those terms. Why not the U.S. is not coming back to the CPTPP, and let's work on the BI and B3W, and let's work on the pandemic fighting. So what are the big incentives for us to work together rather than we, as you said, lose for all the decoupling stuff?
Yeah, look, you make a good point, Henry, and I think there are a number of areas of mutual interest with global impact that these two major powers have enormous incentives to work together. And I would just highlight three of them. You mentioned probably, many more than that. But to me, the ones that are the most important and the ones that provide the greatest opportunity are global climate change, global health, and cyber security. And, of those three areas, I think the only area I can point to where we seem to be working together somewhat is climate change, especially at the COP26 conference when there was a joint statement announced at the end of COP26 by the US and China that didn't really contain any new dramatic breakthroughs, but it did contain a joint commitment, and that's exactly what the type of thing you need. On global health, this has been an enormous opportunity for the two countries to work together to deal with an absolutely horrible pandemic. But, in the United States, we focused more on the COVID origins debate and on blaming China for a global pandemic. And that's prevented us from the type of collaborative research and scientific discovery and sharing of public health practices that we need to really address this issue globally. And I think, in this cybersecurity area, we're nowhere in terms of really working together to address the major issues, whether they're, ransomware or cyber-related espionage or cyber hacking. This is a global issue. It's not just an issue in the United States or an issue in China. It's an issue that affects, all nations who are now operating in the cyber age and an open architecture global internet platform. So there's a lot we can do. I would just say one other thing, and I developed this point also in my book. Not only do we need a new framework to address structural issues, but we need to find a new way of managing the dialogue between our nations. I was very pleased to see that President Biden and President Xi had a virtual summit last month. But we need more than just, two leaders sitting, in front of computer screens, every 6 months or, when they can travel again, having dinner together or something like that. I have proposed that the two nations establish a permanent secretariat that it would be an office staffed by a large number of high-level professionals from China and the United States that would work jointly in an office in a neutral nation, call it Switzerland if you want, and they work full-time on all aspects of the U.S.-China relationship, from some of the trade and tariff issues to the technology issues to health and climate and cyber. And they develop joint proposals for policy, joint databases, and they manage disputes that arise between the two nations over agreements that they have signed into law. This relationship is too important to leave to, a meeting that takes place, once a year or twice a year. Even before COVID, when we had the strategic and economic dialogue, that was only once a year under Obama, twice a year under Bush. That's not enough. We need a full-time secretariat to really raise the level of engagement to the level it needs to be at to avoid conflict. And that's an important part of my win-win conflict resolution prescription that I write about. If I tell you more, though, you won't buy the book. There's a lot more to it than that.
Thank you, Steve. Excellent the proposal. I think you've done really very well on that. I totally agree with you. I think this bilateral relation is so important. It's the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and it warrants a special office, a special department to really look at that special office that you said full time, coordinating all aspects of the Sino-US relations, and meets regularly, not just a summit between the two presidents, but maybe regularly on the quarterly basis, and maybe travel to meet in person. I absolutely think that is really important. We need to emphasize, because the two countries' relation really impact not only two countries but also the world. So if there's two bilateral special U.S. office on China, China office on U.S. can really set up and coordinate all the aspects of bilateral relation. That would be really great.
Henry, just to clarify, I don't want two separate offices. I want one office in a neutral country where every day Chinese professionals come to work alongside their American counterparts. They work together in one office, which is why I call it a secretariat. It's not two silos operating separately. It's an integrated approach to joint resolution of areas and issues of mutual interest. And I think that would be far better than having the U.S. side develop its own view, the Chinese side develop its own view, and then they meet, they come together. I want them to be together on a full-time basis.
Oh, that's even further. Of course, maybe let's have a G2 office in both countries, and then let's mix with the staff and meet regularly, daily, if not weekly. So that's a good idea. I think that absolutely do. We need to really increase in intensity communication, dialogue, and proposal exchanges, not related to both countries but to the world. That's a marvelous idea. Regarding the area of collaborating, I have one more question to ask. Is that now U.S. is the largest digital economy. China is the second largest. 38% of China's GDP now relates to digital economy. So on the digital economy, digital infrastructure, and the WTO minister meeting, is postponed, but still digital agreement still hasn't been reached. But that is actually we are all digitalized. But the international rules and regulations, digital governance, digital infrastructure is still here and there missing. But China and the U.S. being the two largest digital economy, how about that area that we come together, set some standards and stimulus for the world, and helping other countries, developing countries to go digital? I mean, internet plus. I mean, you said absolutely right. We have to be cybersecurity. We need to work together. But digital economy, to that matter, how can we work on that? And also currency too. Digital payment. China now is already we don't use wallet or cash anymore. We just use our phone. But what about other countries? How can we get efficiency of payment system and things like that? And so, what do you think of those areas on the digital payment?
Well, it's critical again that we think about the digitization of economic activity from a collaborative and actually from a global point of view. And as the world's two largest digital economies, this is my third area of mutual interest that I emphasize in my new book, that would be of enormous potential for the United States and China to develop and work together. And it requires, the type of ongoing full-time collaboration that I alluded to earlier when I spoke about my proposal for a secretariat. We need to set up bilateral working groups that meet on a regular basis to examine areas like privacy, data security, And I would say one of the most difficult areas that needs to be addressed is the free flow of global information. And this would be a very difficult issue for China because of its strict regime of information control. And so once you get into this area, you open up a lot of issues that are very important to all countries, but they also touch on some highly sensitive issues in China. And I think this will be a very difficult issue for China to address as well, but it needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. We're now almost coming to the end, and my staff was mentioning to me that we, through the CCG live portal and other social media, we have about 40,000 people also joined us online, and so it's great dialogue. But we have actually two questions from, because China News Agency knows that we're having a dialogue with you, so they proposed two questions to you. I just read them out. The first question is that in terms of economic and trade relations, what do you think of the concept of recoupling in China-US economy and trade relation put forward by Kathleen Tai, actually the USTR? In the past few years, has the two countries really decoupled? That's the question one. Question two is that, in your opinion, what's the biggest misunderstanding and biggest misjudgment of China by some people in the United States? And why does the misunderstanding seems to deepen in recent years? So two Chinese media questions.
Well, okay. The new U.S. Trade Ambassador, Catherine Tai, has actually said very little on the Biden administration's China trade policy. She did give a long-awaited speech a couple of months ago, but it was not one that really broke any new ground, nor did it really propose a new approach, and that was disappointing to me. The Biden administration promised a very careful review of Trump administration policy in the first 6 months of 2021. And when the U.S. Trade Representative Tai spoke, presumably after this review had been concluded, there wasn't really much that she offered that gave me the confidence that this was a fresh, new approach to addressing a deepening conflict. And as we've already talked about earlier, Henry, by keeping these tariffs in place at the level they are at right now, is an enormous tax on American companies and on American consumers. It has diverted trade away from China toward other countries, but it's done nothing to resolve the large trade deficit, which politicians fear is taking such a toll on American workers. The two nations are, over the years, become heavily dependent on each other. And I've written about this for a number of years. I've called it codependency, where the U.S. depends on China and China depends on the U.S. And, that condition still exists, but the trade war is unwinding that relationship, and but it's still a very deep one, and let's hope that we can get a better approach. In terms of the second question, the biggest misconception is the one that I addressed earlier, and that is that the American middle class has been led to believe incorrectly that it is suffering stagnation in its real wages because of China. And that view has been examined very carefully by a number of academics, including myself. Unfortunately, many academics, have concluded that's true. And with all due respect, I have to say they're wrong because of the simple point I made to you earlier, Henry. Just like we had with Japan 30 years ago, we had a similar state of affairs with China as the largest piece of a growing trade deficit. But this was much more a reflection of America's own problems of weak saving, which are getting worse because of the big budget deficits we have right now, rather than a problem with Japan 30 years ago or China today. And yet, the politicians in Washington, who are responsible, by the way, for our budget deficits, would rather blame other countries for problems that they have created. And that has led to a major misconception in the United States with respect to the role that China plays in affecting middle class, hardworking American workers.
Yeah, great. So thank you, Steve. That I think we have covered a very wide ranging of topic this morning and this evening, and we talk about Sino-U.S. relations, the latest development, from President Trump to President Biden. What are the misconceptions and what are the potential conflict, accidental conflict, and your new book, but also. We talked about what other areas can be cooperated, and also the what are the biggest misconceptions that you just outlined. I think we have covered a wide range. You are such a excellent analyst of China-U.S. relations. I mean, we benefit very often of your wisdom and your recommendation, and in particular, like your idea of we set up a special office, mixed by two. Working level, high level officials, so that we can really regularly meet and discuss and propose, so that we can really clear up a lot of misunderstanding, but also putting up new proposals, gradually reshape this narrative, and also maybe finding the real problem that we can tackle with, so that we don't blame each other on the issues. So this is really great. We are having a special CCG chair section coming up in the next 20 minutes. So before you go, your last word and your view for the next year. What do you think? What do you think of the economist forecast for next year?
Well, I've been a forecaster, Henry, now for about 50 years, and I spent the better part of my career on Wall Street as a forecaster. I got some right and I got some wrong, but I got more right than wrong because I never lost my job, which is something that I can't say for most of my competitors. But what I've learned is, every year is full of surprises. And, a year ago, we had a view of the world that certainly turned out to be much different than we thought was the case at the end of 2020. And I think that, in looking out over the next year or so, I think we'll be surprised at some of the changes that will occur relative to our expectations today. But I think, we've talked a lot about the United States and China. And I think we both agree that this relationship is the most important relationship in the world. It needs a lot of work. It's in danger right now. This is the worst the relationship has been since the advent of the modern relationship began in the early 1970s when President Nixon and Henry Kissinger went to China. It is bad right now. And so it is incumbent upon us to change that dynamic. And if we don't do a better job than we have been doing, I think a year from now, we will be in a more difficult place and will regret the opportunity that we have squandered. So this is an important juncture in the relationship between our two economies. We can't just say, well, we've built a lot of connections between us that, business has benefited, and we know that. That's not enough to keep this relationship on track. We have to do better. We have to come up with a new approach. And I've tried to discuss with you some of my thoughts and ideas. I'm sure there are other ideas and other people who have thought about this differently. But we've got to put an end to this conflict before it is too late.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. I think you outlined so well. I think absolutely, Sino-US relations is the most important bilateral relation. That is not only going to impact today, will impact next year, and it will impact us next 10 years or next half a century. So we are seeing the lowest point probably in the last past half century. We need to work together to revive to the normal relations and also make it beneficial to both countries and to the world. So once again, thank you, Steve, very much for joining us this evening, and also thank our audience online. And we hope to see you again, and hope to see you visiting CCG when you come to China. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. I look forward to seeing you again in person.
Thank you. Okay. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.